So let me talk a bit about our 25th, about the book that's in front of you. Our story begins in 1989. And that was a time primarily in the West that a lot of people were frustrated with never-ending deficits, government overspending, and high taxes. And these people protested the GST, not because the tax that GST was replacing was anything better, but because they saw the government creating a new tax lever at a time they should have been zeroed in on their overspending. So Axe the tax rally sprung up. They weren't successful in stopping the GST, but they were successful in creating an understanding. And that understanding was that reacting to government decisions that were already made only measured our loss as taxpayers. Remember at the time that the GST first came in, it was at 9%, and those rallies helped you reduce it when it was finally brought into 7%. But if taxpayers were to have a voice, if taxpayers were to have impact, they needed a professional and permanent taxpayer advocacy group that would pre-act rather than react to government decisions. And so was born the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Its founder, a gentleman by the name of Kevin Avram, set up shop in the city of Regina. The organization would be non-profit, and importantly, it would be non-partisan. And although worded moderately different to start, its mission statement then as today is lower taxes, less waste, and accountable government. Now that what I just gave you is the academic description of our founding. A more accurate description about our founding might be found in the opening story of my book. It involves a gentleman by the name of Rod Cunningham and Ryan Weir. And they're out knocking on doors in rural Saskatchewan in the early 1990s. They're holding tattered petitions, copies of this taxpayer magazine, and receipt books. And they're hoping to earn a donation for this fledgling organization called the CTF. So they arrive at a farm near Limerick, Saskatchewan. They park the truck, and they get out of the truck, and they hear a commotion going on over in the grain bin. They mosey over, and they stick their head through a small window in the grain bin. And they see a farmer's back. He's shoveling his crop, and they say, the farmer says, "How are you today?" Rod yells. The farmer responds, "Good, good. How can I help you, gentlemen?" Rod says, "We're here at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation." Well, with one foul swoop, the farmer turns and he swings his shovel so hard it actually sticks about 8 inches in the 2x4 above where their head is. Quickly, the farmer exits the bin. Now the shovel's cocked behind his shoulder. He says, "I'm going to knock your heads off." There's poor Rod Cunningham. He's standing there. He's got one arm up to defend himself and the other arm's up as a fist. He's looking behind his shoulder for reinforcement, but Ryan's already back in the truck. He's got all the windows rolled up, scouting around for keys. Safe to say the two didn't manage to get a donation, but they did manage to leave with their heads intact. I tell that story because it demonstrates so clearly the real work in starting something. There was no existing donor base. There was no corporation or deep-pocketed donor with seed funding. The very first interview I did in British Columbia when we launched the book last week was, who gave us seed funding to get going? And the answer is, of course, a shovel-wielding farmer and the many doors like that we knocked on in the early days. Those days were letters to mail, there were phone calls to make, and doors to knock on. And every one of them was introducing the concept of a taxpayers organization for the first time. Now, some, obviously, not understanding that we were there to save tax dollars, not a government agency coming to take tax dollars. The important thing is, though, that Rod and Ryan kept knocking on doors. In that first year in 1990-91, we raised $170,000 in donations. And that was enough to hire a researcher in Regina to begin to dig into some bite-sized campaigns that would garner attention and build a larger supporter base. We calculated, for example, what MLAs would receive in severance when they left office. We learned about the clean office policy, which we used to describe the practice that an MLA, after they left office voluntarily or were defeated, could back a truck up to their office, take all the furnishings and equipment out of it, and keep it as their own personal property. We pried from the government various loans and grants that were given to businesses, and we dubbed it corporate welfare. We sent out commentaries, did media interviews. We offered speakers at events. and began the practice of a magazine which is still with us 25 years later called The Taxpayer. In all cases, we were releasing and bringing public attention to how tax dollars are being spent, and importantly, they were issues that the opposition politicians themselves often had no interest in blowing the whistle on. In 1991, we moved next door to this province. We expanded by hiring a fellow by the name of Jason Kenney to head up operations. And Jason established a number of priorities. But one thing he did very early on was to start to calculate MLA pensions. Now remember, prior to the CTF coming along, no one knew. Taxpayers did not know what politicians were paying themselves in pension benefits. Many MLAs at that time were making their way for the exits for a very unpopular government led by Don Getty at the time. And every time someone left, Jason would calculate their pension and release it. And he was amazed how much media coverage this got. So he decided that he was going to calculate all the MLAs that were going to leave. And it was on April 20th, 1993, that he held a press conference with a report showing that 29 MLAs in Alberta would be eligible for $40 million in pension benefits. Now at the time, that was about $80,000 a year in first-year benefits. If you index that to today's dollars, that was $120,000 a year the average MLA would be leaving this province when they finished their term. He also had a petition signed by 40,000 Albertans demanding reform of the system. So along comes a new premier by the name of Ralph Klein, who was asked to respond to this report. Well, he held a scrum, said the CTF was making all of it up. None of it was true. And in fact, the CTF was going door to door, stealing money from senior citizens. Poor Rod and Ryan. First they're being chased with shovels, now they're being accused of stealing money from the elderly. So Jason got a call on his brick cell phone back in the day, and a reporter said, "You got to come back down to the legislature. You're not going to believe what the premier just said." So Jason does a U-turn in his car, comes back down to the legislature. Immediately, scrum develops around him, and he's trying to respond calmly to all these charges that Ralph Klein had made. All of a sudden, out of the corner of his eyes, he sees someone bounding down the hallway toward the scrum. All of a sudden, the cameras part, and there stands Ralph Klein, King Ralph. And he was all too happy to repeat every claim he had just made earlier in the day. There was Jason Kenney, a 23-year-old, going toe-to-toe with the Premier of Alberta. And by any measure, he won that exchange that was played out on newscasts across the country. It was only a few days after that confrontation that Premier Ralph Klein marched into his caucus meeting to tell his colleagues that the MLA pension plan was done. Which, by the way, was far more than the CTF was asking for. All we were asking for was that the plan be on a dollar-for-dollar basis. Now, Ralph took it a step further and outright abolished the plan. To say the organization exploded after that would be an understatement. But here's the important thing about that. The pension plan was a symbolic issue. The Globe and Mail wrote a piece afterwards that said it created a market for its core agenda. Because 1 month later, the Klein government would table a budget that cut spending by 20% over 4 years and introduced a Deficit Elimination Act that required, by law, the budget be balanced in 4 years. The same thing was happening next door in Saskatchewan. The province's Economic Development Agency was closed, severance payments severed, and the clean office policy was ended. The bigger picture was changing. It was a Conservative government in Alberta, it was an NDP government in Saskatchewan that were backing their provinces away from the fiscal cliff. The next issue was whether a Liberal government in Ottawa could do the same. And so it was during this time we commissioned a well-known CTF staple, the National Debt Clock. I think as everyone in this room knows, it showed the per-second increase in borrowing as well as the increase in debt for a family of four. And the first version of this clock was a bloody beast. 600 pounds. Everywhere we took it, we had to hire a tow truck to lift it onto its stand. But it packed a punch. Everywhere it went, it made the debt more tangible to people, and it earned every bit of local media coverage that we had hoped for. I remember in the fall of 1994, the House of Commons Finance Committee, along with Finance Minister Paul Martin, crisscrossing the country conducting pre-budget hearings. We set that clock up in front of every place that pre-budget consultations were taking place that we could. And I tell you, it really pissed off all the groups that were coming in to preach for more money being spent. The deficit was at a crisis point in the mid-1990s. You got to remember at that time, interest payments consumed 30 cents of every tax dollar that we were sending to Ottawa. The Wall Street Journal declared in an editorial that, quote, Canada had now become an honorary member of the third world in the unmanageability of its debt. Yet the politicians still floated taxes as the way to solve the problem. You know, in the 10 years between 1983 and 1993, federal government revenues had doubled from $61 billion to $121 billion. Yet, during the same time, the deficit had never, ever been higher. The government did not have a revenue problem. Probably the seminal moment came on CTV's Canada AM in early January, when Toronto Liberal MP Dennis Mills famously said that if the government raised personal income taxes in February's budget, Canadians would, quote, complain for a few days, then they'll roll over. As Jason reflected in the video we played earlier, this was our moment. This is what the CTF was created for. We were going to prevent this from happening. By 1994, we had a staff presence in the 4 western provinces and a dedicated volunteer presence in Ontario. Now, I started with the organization here in Alberta in 1992, but moved to open a BC office, my home province, in 1993. Now, we as a group decided at the time that we would organize a massive petition drive and a series of rallies across the country under the simple slogan, no more taxes. This would be the pre-action that we did not have before the GST protests. So the first rally fell to us in my home province of British Columbia, in Kelowna. I had no idea what to expect. I was sitting that night nervously in a restaurant. There was a window in the restaurant. I could see out the door of the entranceway, worried that the cameras would show up and pan empty seats as no one showed up. But sure enough, that night, the door was handed off from one person to the next before the door closed. And pretty soon I was up from my dinner scrambling to find the catering manager to open the walls up. And sure enough, there was no one else booked in the hotel that night. And we were able to open up the walls. And when we finally called that meeting to order that night, we had 800 people in the room and national news coverage. Well, the rest was history from that point forward. We had events topping several thousand by the time we got to Ontario. And importantly, we had a 250,000 signature petition that was handed off to Paul Martin before he delivered his 1995 budget. The 1995 budget was undoubtedly the single most significant budget of this organization's 25-year history, in terms of core review, in terms of cutting spending, in terms of moving the country to a balanced budget. The Wall Street Journal followed up in its February editorial by writing on March 1st, 1995 that, quote, the grassroots campaign had an impact. Mr. Martin was able to sell deeper spending cuts to his cabinet colleagues and steer them from raising taxes on personal income. Now, I'm not going to stand here and say it was just the CTF. There was the Reform Party, the think tank community, many like-minded media commentators, and he came in late. I didn't recognize him. Lauren Gunter from The Sun, who also wrote the foreword to the book, and thank you for that, Lauren. People like Lauren and the think tank community and others worked hard in building a public consensus around these policies that led not only to the provinces and federal government balancing their budgets, but remember at the time that a lot of provinces passed laws requiring that budgets be balanced, and in some places like Ontario, the voters must approve any future tax increases. You know, if you fast forward to 2008, In much of the world that slid into recession, by any measure, we weathered that storm relatively well. It had, however, nothing to do with the measures taken at the time by the current government. Rather, it was the budgets and policy decisions of the mid-1990s that put Canada in a position to manage that economic downturn with less economic shock than was experienced in many other parts of the world. So as for the CTF, we earned our stripes outside of Alberta and Saskatchewan. We grew. We opened an office in the nation's capital and eventually in Atlantic Canada. We played a key role in campaigns to lower taxes in the early 2000s, and especially the elimination of bracket creep taxation that we were widely credited with in 2000. We also cemented our brand. On the cover of the book is Porky the Waste Hater. The book tells many stories of making a point with flair, with creativity, and a sense of humor. Porky, of course, is the star of our annual Waste Awards, the Teddies. It's a mock Oscar ceremony that we do once a year in Ottawa. We mentioned earlier the debt clock, blowing up inflatable senators and the like. I always think it's important to realize about us, the first part in getting a message out is to get paid attention to first and foremost. And we've tried to do that in all cases. The first story of really using a stunt to get attention actually also falls in 1995. There was a bill before Parliament, C-85. And it was a bill to reform modestly the MP pensions. We wanted to speak before the committee examining the bill, and they denied us the opportunity to speak. So in order to draw attention to being shut out of these hearings, our Ontario director at the time, Paul Pagnuello, came up with the idea that we'd put some pigs on the back of a flatbed and maybe get a bullhorn and drive down Wellington Street to try and create some hubbub. So we called the Ontario Hog Producers Association and asked if we could get some pigs to do this stunt. And they said, well, this is an extremely unusual request. We're going to have to get back to you on this. They called, I think, the next morning and said, no, we've met with some folks, we've talked about it, and we've decided we're not going to support this request because we're tired of having our livelihood associated with politicians all the time. So we found these wonderful pigs, plastic pigs at Canadian Tire, with this wonderful smile on their faces, and they're sort of leaned out, and we managed to find 242 of them. In fact, I think we cleaned out every Canadian Tire in southern Ontario to get the number of pigs, the number of MPs that had refused to opt out of the MP pension plan at the time. What was really rewarding, two things were really rewarding about that story. One is that the next day, May 31st, 1995, the Globe and Mail ran a picture of these pigs on the front page of the Globe and Mail. It was the first time we'd ever earned front page banner coverage in a major national daily. But here's the other thing. We got into the hearings. They couldn't ignore all of the attention that we had garnered to get into those hearings. So where are we today? Well, if we measure as a percentage of our economy, our GDP, government is smaller and total revenues are less than they were 25 years ago. But I'm not calling it a victory because most recent policy is certainly moving in the opposite direction. I quote Margaret Thatcher at the end of the book, who has a quote that says, "In economics, there are no final victories." Nonetheless, I will say there has been this. The solution of bigger and more government to solve all of our problems is challenged to a far greater extent in this country than it was 25 years ago. And a great example is deficits. There's less tolerance for prolonged deficits. The last time the federal government went into deficit, it took 27 years before they balanced a budget again. This second time, starting in 2009, it's lasted only 7 years. And the same goes for tax increases. Even Tom Mulcair says he will not raise personal taxes under any circumstance. And so the last quarter of my book is battles ahead. I look at 5 issues I believe will matter significantly to taxpayers going forward. I just want to mention one briefly. I call it borrowed time, borrowed money, and the aging population, or what might be a better title is the debts we see and the debts we don't see. The accumulated deficits, the annual overspending of governments each year, is what we add to the debt clock, is what you see churning away on the debt clock. All governments in Canada, if you include federal, provincial, and the agencies, owe $61 billion in interest payments. Now, 61 billion, a quadrillion, a gajillion, it means nothing. I want to break that down. Every day in Canada, our government's taxpayers spend $169 million a day just to pay interest on our debts. That's more than we spend on all schooling in this country from K through post-secondary education. But that is just the debts that we see. What about those we don't see? Economists use the term unfunded liability to describe a promise to pay for something in which there are very few or no savings. The pension obligations of retired government workers, healthcare, seniors benefits like OAS and GIS. Not only is the population aging and people living longer, we are having fewer and fewer children. Today's social programs are built on the assumption that there would always be more working taxpayers tomorrow than today. Not only is that not true, it's just the opposite, and it is dramatically so. So it's not rocket science. As a growing number of people move from working income to retirement income, governments receive less tax revenue. Meanwhile, government spending programs become more costly. Think about some of these statistics, and I talk about them in the book. The Canadian Institute of Actuary estimates that current trajectory of spending will have healthcare consuming 103% of provincial budgets by 2037. Government workers. Statistically, the average teacher in Alberta and Ontario, and I suspect most provinces, spend more time drawing a pension check in retirement than they do a working check by an average of 5 years. Billions of dollars are covering government pension shortfalls each year, and seldom is it is reported. One of the most remarkable stories I found in doing research for the book was a small town, 3,800, in Spring Hill, Nova Scotia. Last year voted to dissolve itself as a community rather than stay on the hook for pension payouts to its retired police force. They could not afford it. So there's nothing wrong with getting older. There's nothing wrong with living longer. But there's a huge problem with kicking these promises down the road and expecting the next generation to magically pay for it. It's a path to moral bankruptcy. It's a path to financial bankruptcy. Yes, more immigration helps, more babies, more technological change. But as McGill professor Chris Regan, who's one of the leading experts on this subject in Canada, says, quote, spending programs can be reduced or eliminated, or taxes can be increased. There is nothing else. Our total debt in Canada, when you include unfunded liabilities, is $2.9 trillion. We need to urgently balance our budgets. But more fundamentally, we need to reform our social programs to put them on a secure, long-term footing. And in the book, I talk about some of the solutions that I think we can do to address that. The bottom line is it's not about ideology, it's about mathematics. And it's what realistic in terms of the tax burden that we will leave our next generation. Many of you know in this room about Generation Screwed. It's a youth initiative that we've initiated across Canada. One of its leaders, Mark Jacka, is here in the room with us this afternoon. Mark, thank you for your work and leadership on that initiative. And that's important for us to understand those challenges, but also for that generation themselves to speak up, because they're not always going to hear it from their university professors. Let me share a story that illustrates the challenge that I think is in front of us. In 2006, John Williamson was our federal spokesperson. He goes before the House of Commons Finance Committee to argue each year, as our spokespeople do in Ottawa and the provincial capitals, the governments could spend less here, spend less there, prioritize their spending there, be more efficient. And as he's talking, all of a sudden, a rookie member of the committee says, whoa, 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 whoa. Mr. Williamson, I don't understand. What are you saying? Our committee has been across the country. We've heard dozens, if not hundreds, of witnesses come before us, and every one of them has asked for governments to spend more money. You are the first person to stand before this committee and suggest the government spend less. That doesn't happen. Now, this rookie MP's staff had tracked all of the presentations before this committee and found that there had been over $600 billion in requests to spend more money. The entire federal government spent in 2006 $220 billion. One of my favorite economists is the great 19th century French economist Frédéric Bastiat, who put it this way: government is that great fictitious entity where everyone endeavors to live at the expense of everybody else. It may seem strange that taxpayers are outnumbered and outgunned, but they are for the simple reason that beneficiaries of government largesse have far greater incentive to be organized and forceful than those who pay a couple bucks a year for any given government expenditure. In the conclusion of my book, I note the Canadian Union of Public Employees had a budget of $159 million in 2010. That included $43.7 million for a national defense fund and $2.5 million to, quote, fight privatization. By contrast, the CTF, also a national organization, had a budget that same year of $3.2 million that included $784,000 for all communications and all campaigns. CUPE is just one union representing one set of government workers. There's dozens of other unions across the country have their own budgets, as do the organizations and businesses that back 8,500 registered lobbyists in Ottawa. It's a 24% increase in the number of lobbyists in Ottawa since 2010. And that's to say nothing more of the hundreds more that exist in the provincial capitals. If you combine all the think tanks, publications, and organizations like the CTF that support limited government in Canada, we don't hold a candle to the resources available to the advocates of big government. But here's the great thing: they don't always win. And let me tell you a story in my home province that gives me some optimism. Right now we're in the middle of a referendum in Metro Vancouver on a proposed 0.5% increase in the sales tax to fund the local transit authority. The litany of waste of this organization is too long for me to go through, and I couldn't even fit in the pages of my book. But here's what you need to know about the campaign that's going on in Vancouver. There are 140 organizations that support a yes vote, including the Vancouver Board of Trade, the BC Chamber of Commerce, and virtually every business organization in the province. Every major labor organization supports a yes vote. Every environmental group, including Greenpeace and the Suzuki Foundation. Both the governing Liberals and the opposition NDP support a yes vote, as does the Green Party and the only independent MLA from Delta. The Vancouver Sun supports a yes vote editorially. The yes side has a budget of $7 million. All of it is tax dollars to support a yes vote. On the other side is the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and a later joiner, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, with a budget of $40,000. The last poll before the mail-in ballot opened has us up 2-1 in that vote. So as I write this, the outcome is not certain. But win or lose, the referendum campaign represents exactly what the founders of the CTF hoped to achieve in the aftermath of the rallies protesting the GST. They wanted to create an organization that gave taxpayers a voice before government decisions were imposed. So there's a lot of reasons we've managed to stick around for 25 years. But the most important reason, to conclude, is many of you standing in this room. Over 25 years, tens of thousands of Canadians, through their moral and financial support, made a taxpayers organization possible. You know, when I explain to people I'm meeting for the first time what I do, usually one of the first questions that comes up is, well, how do you fund it? It must be governments, corporations fund it, foundations fund it. How do you fund it? And the answer is the shovel-wielding farmer in Limerick, Saskatchewan, because the conclusion to that story is we let him calm down after a couple of years, and somebody else went back down that same dusty farm road, parked their car, and this time he understood it wasn't the government coming to take his money, but someone coming to help him save a few bucks. He invited him into his house. They sat down, they had coffee. He signed a few petitions and also signed a check to support the organization. And he did so without charitable tax status. I dedicate my book to our supporters because every page of it has been brought to life because of you. So very humbly I say thank you, and know that nothing energizes, motivates, and importantly legitimizes who we are and what we do more than the constituency we represent for the last 25 years and for the next 25 years. So thank you again to our sponsors. Thank you for coming, and thank you for giving taxpayers a voice in Canada.